I know the race of telepaths is an old gimmick that's been used in new planet adventure stories for centuries, but maybe we've finally found one. I don't like it, Carl, Logren said. If they're telepaths, why don't they understand us? And if they're telepaths, why do they talk at all? And you can't convince me that this boodly oodly doodle of theirs isn't talking. Well, our neural structure and theirs won't be nearly alike, Phaon said. I know this analogy between telepathy and radio is full of holes, but it's good enough for this. Our wavelength can't be picked up with their sets. The deuce it can't, Goffredo contradicted. I've been bothered about that from the beginning. These people act as though they got meaning from us. Not the meaning we intend, but some meaning. When Paul made the gobbledygook speech, they all reacted in the same way, frightened and then defensive. The you-me routine simply bewildered them, as we'd be at a set of semantically lucid but self-contradictory statements. When Lillian tried to introduce herself, they were shocked and horrified. It looked to me like actual physical disgust, Anna interpolated. When I tried it, they acted like a lot of puppies being petted. And when Mark tried it, they were simply baffled. I watched Mark explaining that steel knives were dangerously sharp. They got the demonstration. But when he tried to tie words onto it, it threw them completely. All right, past that, Logren conceded. But if they have telepathy, why do they use spoken words? Oh, I can answer that, Anna said. Say they communicated by speech originally and developed their telepathic faculty slowly and without realizing it. They'd go on using speech. And since the message would be received telepathically ahead of the spoken message, nobody would pay any attention to the words as such. Everybody would have a spoken language of his own. It would be a sort of instrumental accompaniment to the song. Some of them don't bother speaking, Carl nodded. They just toot. I'll buy that right away, Logren agreed. In mating or in group danger situations, telepathy would be a race survival characteristic. It would be selected for genetically, and the non-gifted strains would tend to die out. It wouldn't do. It wouldn't do at all. He said so. Look at their technology. We either have a young race, just emerged from savagery, or an old, stagnant race. All indications seem to favor the latter. A young race would not have time to develop telepathy as Anna suggests. An old race would have gone much farther than these people have. Progress is a matter of communication and pooling ideas and discoveries. Make a trend graph of technological progress on Terra. Every big jump comes after an improvement in communications. The printing press, railways and steamships, the telegraph, radio. Then think how telepathy would speed up the progress. The sun was barely past noon meridian before the savants, who had ventured down into the fields at sunrise, were returning to the mound village. In the snooper screen they could be seen coming up in tunics and breechclouts, entering houses and emerging in long robes. There seemed to be no bows or spears in evidence, but the big horn sounded occasionally. Paul Millard was pleased. Even if it had been by sign talk, which he rated with worm fishing for trout or shooting sitting rabbits, he had gotten something across to them. When they went to the village at 1500, they had trouble getting their lorry down. A couple of Marines in a jeep had to go in first to get the crowd out of the way. Several of the locals, including the one with the staff, joined with them. This quick cooperation delighted Millard. When they had the lorry down and were all out of it, the dignitary with the staff, his scarlet tablecloth over his yellow robe, began an oration, apparently with every confidence that he was being understood. In spite of his objections at lunch, the telepathy theory was beginning to seem more persuasive. "Give them the shooting of Dan McJabberwocky again," he told Millard. "This is where we came in yesterday." Something Millard had noticed was exciting him. Wait a moment. They're going to do something. They were indeed. The one with the staff and three of his henchmen advanced. The staff-bearer touched himself on the brow. "Fwonk," he said. Then he pointed to Millard. "Horky," he said. They got it! Lillian was hugging herself joyfully. I knew they ought to. Millard indicated himself and said, "Fwonk." That wasn't right. The village elder immediately corrected him. The word, it seemed, was "fwonk." His three companions agreed that that was the word for self, but that was as far as the agreement went. They rendered it respectively as poink, tweelt, and cloche. Goffredo gave a barking laugh. He was right. Anything that could go wrong would go wrong. Lillian used a word. It was not a ladylike word at all. The savants looked at them as though wondering what could possibly be the matter. Then they went into a huddle, arguing vehemently. The argument spread like a ripple in a pool. Soon everybody was twittering vocally and blowing on flutes and panpipes. Then the big horn started blaring. Immediately, Goffredo snatched the handphone of his belt radio and began speaking urgently into it. "What are you doing, Louis?" Millard asked anxiously. "Calling the reserve in. I'm not taking chances on this." He spoke again into the phone, then called over his shoulder, "Renette, 3 one-second bursts in the air." A Marine pointed a submachine gun skyward and ripped off a string of shots. Then another and another. There was silence after the first burst. Then a frightful howling arose. "Louis, you imbecile!" Millard was shouting. Goffredo jumped onto the top of an airjeep where they could all see him. Drawing his pistol, he fired it twice into the air. "Be quiet, all of you!" he shouted, as though that would do any good. It did. Silence fell, bounced noisily, and then settled over the crowd. Goffredo went on talking to them. "Take it easy now, easy." He might have been speaking to a frightened dog or a fractious horse. "Nobody's going to hurt you. This is nothing but the great noise magic of the Terrans." "Get the presents unloaded," Millard was saying. "Make a big show of it. The table first." The horn, which had started, stopped blowing. As they were getting off the long table and piling it with trade goods, another lorry came in, disgorging 20 Marine riflemen. They had their bayonets fixed. The natives looked apprehensively at the bare steel, but went on listening to Goffredo. Millard pulled the Lord Mayor, Archbishop, Lord of the Manor aside and began making sign talk to him. When quiet was restored, Howell put a pick and shovel into a wheelbarrow and pushed them out into the space that had been cleared in front of the table. He swung the pick for a while, then shoveled the barrow full of ground. After pushing it around for a while, he dumped it back in the hole and leveled it off. 2 Marines brought out an 8-inch log and chopped a couple of billets off it with an axe. Then cut off another one with the saws, split them, and filled the wheelbarrow with the firewood. "We can't use the computer till we can tell it what the data is data about. The knives, jewelry, and other small items would be no problem. They had enough of them to go around. The other stuff would be harder to distribute, and Paul Millard and Karl Dorver were arguing about how to handle it. If they weren't careful, a lot of new Bowie knives would get bloodied." "Have them form a queue," Anna suggested. "That will give them the idea of equal sharing, and we'll be able to learn something about their status levels and social hierarchy and agonistic relations." The one with the staff took it as a matter of course that he would go first. His associates began falling in behind him, and the rest of the villagers behind them. Whether they'd gotten one the day before or not, everybody was given a knife and a bandana and one piece of flashy junk jewelry, Also a stainless steel cup and mess plate, a bucket, and an empty bottle with a cork. The women didn't carry sheath knives, so they got Boy Scout knives on lanyards. They were all lavishly supplied with XT3 and candy. Any of the children who looked big enough to be trusted with them got knives too, and plenty of candy. Anna and Carl were standing where the queue was forming, watching how they fell into line. So was Lillian with an audio-visual camera. Having seen that the Marine enlisted men were getting the presents handed out properly, Howell strolled over to them. Just as he came up, a couple approached hesitantly, a man in a breechclout under a leather apron, and a woman much smaller in a ragged and soiled tunic. As soon as they fell into line, another Svant, in a blue robe, pushed them aside and took their place. "Here, you can't do that!" Lillian cried. "Carl, make him step back." Carl was saying something about social status and precedence. The couple tried to get into line behind the man who had pushed them aside. Another villager tried to shove them out of his way. Howell advanced, his right fist closing. Then he remembered that he didn't know what he'd be punching. He might break the fellow's neck or his own knuckles. He grabbed the blue-robed Svant by the wrist with both hands, kicked a foot out from under him, and jerked, sending him flying for 6 feet, and then sliding in the dust for another couple of yards. He pushed the others back and put the couple into place in their line. "Mark, you shouldn't have done that," Dorver was expostulating. "We don't know—" The Svant sat up, shaking his head groggily. Then he realized what had been done to him. With a snarl of rage, he was on his feet, his knife in his hand. It was a Terran Bowie knife. Without conscious volition, Howell's pistol was out and he was thumbing the safety off. The Svant stopped short, then dropped the knife, ducked his head, and threw his arms over it to shield his comb. He backed away a few steps, then turned and bolted into the nearest house. The others, including the woman in the ragged tunic, were twittering in alarm. Only the man in the leather apron was calm. He was saying tonelessly, "Grog, grog." Louis Goffredo was coming up on the double, followed by 3 of his riflemen. "What happened, Mark? Trouble?" "All over now." He told Goffredo what had happened. Dorver was still objecting. "Social precedence. The savant may have been right, according to local customs." "Local customs be damned." Goffredo became angry. "This is a Terran Federation handout. We make the rules, and one of them is no pushing people out of line. Teach the buggers that now, and we won't have to work so hard at it later." He called back over his shoulder, "Situation under control. Get the show going again." The natives were all grimacing heartbrokenly with pleasure. Maybe the one who got thrown on his ear— no, he didn't have any— was not one of the more popular characters in the village. "You just pulled your gun and he dropped the knife and ran?" Goffredo asked. "And the others were scared too?" "That's right. They all saw you fire yours. The noise scared them." Goffredo nodded. "We'll avoid promiscuous shooting then. No use letting them find out the noise won't hurt them any sooner than we have to." Paul Millard had worked out a way to distribute the picks and shovels and axes. Considering each house as representing a family unit, which might or might not be the case, there were picks and shovels enough to go around, and an axe for every 3rd house. They took them around in an air jeep and left them at the doors. The houses, he found, weren't adobe at all. They were built of logs, plastered with adobe on the outside. That demolished his theory that the houses were torn down periodically and left the mound itself unexplained. The wheelbarrows and the grindstone and the 2 crosscut saws were another matter. Nobody was quite sure that the nobility, capitalist class, politicians, prominent citizens wouldn't simply appropriate them for themselves. Paul Millard was worried about that. Everybody else was willing to let matters take their course. Before they were off the ground in their vehicles, a violent dispute had begun, with a bedlam of jabbering and shrieking. By the time they were landing at the camp, the big laminated leather horn had begun to bellow. End of Part 2.